a really stark warning earlier today from the MI5 boss, warning that Iran and Russia are recruiting UK people to conduct terror plots on our streets, and that 1 in 6 people investigated is under the age of 18. He said a lot more besides. So Natasha Clark, LBC's political editor, is going to talk us through it. These are rare speeches, aren't they? I mean, we've got it's newish, really, for them to be seen at all, these individuals, but it's equally rare for them to speak.
It is. Ken McCallum does not speak very much in public at all, and the last time he did this was around 2 years ago, and we do hear occasional snippets of him in the press. He warned earlier about the threat of universities being infiltrated by foreign actors. He talked about the rise of China. He also spoke earlier this year ahead of the election about warning about election interference with our candidates. But having a big speech like this doesn't happen very often. And I think it's fair to say that he had a lot of things that he wanted to talk about. So he described what I think was the most interesting thing of the speech, talking about the rise of children being investigated for terrorism in the UK. He called that staggering. He was speaking earlier at one of MI5's operating centres in West London about the range of threats that Britain's spooks are trying to combat. And one of those things that he said was that 1 in 8 being investigated are kids under the age of 18.
We're also seeing far too many cases of very young people being drawn into poisonous online extremism. Sadly, 13% of all those being investigated by MI5 for involvement in UK terrorism are under 18. That's a 3-fold increase in the last 3 years. Extreme right-wing terrorism in particular skews heavily towards young people, driven by propaganda that shows a canny understanding of online culture.
And we had our usual update about the number of terror plots that have been foiled, 43 since March 2017. He also talked about how he was most worried about the regrowing threat from Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, obviously 2 groups which we've really seen decline in recent years. But he says that they are on the rise again and resurging in a number of ways. Obviously topical as well, talking about Iran. He said that the UK has defeated 20 similar plots from Iran-backed groups since January 2022. Really interesting on that.
Just to be clear on the kind of plots he's talking about, these are advanced plots that would have caused death or mass death.
Absolutely, yes. He didn't go into any detail about what they were and about when they were, but he did say that the last couple of years, the threat to Brits on our own streets from Iran-backed groups has gone up quite a lot. So yes, a pretty gloomy speech there. He's, talking about threats being more so than ever before. He's obviously running a very stretched security service. He's talking about 75% is sort of Islamic state-based threat terror, but then the other 25% is from extreme right-wing terror as well. So he's got these two competing
some of which
interests.
we saw in the summer, didn't we?
Exactly, and he did sort of allude to that. He didn't he didn't sort of say that there was any sort of link to any sort of wrong-end states within the riots that we saw on our streets, but they were very alive to the possibility that they could be capitalised on by rogue states such as China, such as Russia, all posing huge threats to us. And interestingly, Sheila, also another hint as well that the Middle East could be an effect of that war there could eventually be seen on the streets here in the UK. Said it hadn't happened yet, but a very big yet. I think that was a bit of a hint from him that we could potentially see that come on our streets at some point in the future.
The question of what Russia is doing is an interesting one, isn't it? Because we've seen out-and-out terrorism by Russia on our streets already with the Skripal poisoning, Litvinenko earlier than that. We know that there are nation states, let alone terror groups, trying to get their claws into our society and disrupt it. I mean, this has always happened at some level. But is the warning essentially that social media and the online world in particular, almost like everything else, is making it much more prolific and easier for it to become prolific?
Exactly. And one of the other warnings, which I should definitely touch upon, is talking about the risk that criminal gangs in the UK could be at risk of being infiltrated by Russia, by Iran, essentially paying them to act on their behalf as proxies for attacks, for acting illegally within the UK. Again, he was quite light on the detail of what that might look like. But he said the reason that why they're able to do so is, of course, because of the internet. And again, going back to what we were saying earlier about very young people being drawn into terrorist activities, he called it poisonous online extremism, talking about those children who are now being involved and who are now being looked at by MI5. That's gone up threefold in the last 3 years. He said that extreme right-wing terrorism in particular skews heavily towards young people. He said it's driven by propaganda that shows a canny understanding of online culture. So he didn't, obviously, it's not really his job to talk about exactly how we should combat those threats and all the work that his department is, of course, doing to try and do so. But it's very, very clear that the internet, in every sort of walk of his life, is playing a really big part in developing some of these threats that we're seeing, not just from Russia and Iran. And he talked about the rise of state-based threats as well. That's apparently gone up by a whopping around 43%, I think, in the last year alone. So it was just these groups like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, Islamic State, I should say, and lone individuals as well on the internet proving a threat. But now a lot of their work is now being taken up by state-backed threats like Iran, like Russia. Iran. Exactly.
Yeah. It's interesting what he says there about online. He's essentially talking about online radicalisation of young people, whether that's into Islamist violence or extreme right-wing violence. But we've seen, haven't we, in both the riots and in some, and I emphasise some, of the reaction to the war in Gaza and beyond, and the whole situation beyond, we've seen that it isn't just children. And these children don't come out of nowhere. They've got parents as well. It's made all the more difficult if it's, if you have a child who's got caught up in the online world and the parents are horrified and try to work with the police and the teachers to stop that. That's one thing. But if you've got growing numbers of people within the population who think that violence is a means of solving your disagreements, people are absolutely within their rights to have all kinds of views. But if a growing number of adults and their children start to decide that actually terrorism, not just violence, punching someone in the street you disagree with, but active planned terrorism is the way to deal with your disagreements, that's a different kind of warning altogether, isn't it?
It is. And obviously for him, when he's trying to, monitor everything that's going on around the world on not just the internet, but, the dark web as well, he actually talked as well about encryption, because that's a debate that we've obviously had in the UK about whether security services should have access to our private communications. And he says there's just no choice in a world where everything is happening online. He said that the alternative would be to allow child abusers and terrorists to operate at scale without fear of consequence. So obviously, the security service who have, he says, proportionate lawful access to our communications is really a necessary part of trying to monitor all of this stuff that goes on online. And he talked quite a lot about some of the recent cases that we've seen in the media of young children plotting to attack a British synagogue, another posting material that inspired deadly mass shootings in the US, another with plans to stab people at a music festival, sharing terrorist propaganda online. Some really, really worrying examples of things that under 18s are now probably normalised too, I think it's fair to say, online. And he did say that in both cases of Islamic extremism and extreme right-wing terror, lone individuals indoctrinated online are most of the threats that he is dealing with. It is not usually these big terror groups that we might think of, these big scary ISIS, Al-Qaeda groups, but it is lone individuals, and that is going to pose a huge, huge risk to the security services over the next few years, because it's going to be so hard for them to be able to track down every single one of them.
And we've seen how deadly a lone individual who's decided it's time to launch a terror attack can be. We saw it in Westminster, we saw it in London Bridge, we've seen it in all kinds of ways. The question of who gets access to the nuts and bolts of British life is an interesting one, I think. If you think of Russia, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a sort of reckoning, wasn't there, of whether we had allowed too much Russian money in because of the economic benefits that came with it. But that we hear today from Mr. McCallum, the head of MI5, that of the 750 Russian intelligence service people who'd been kicked out from Europe, that is, not just from here, 750 Russian diplomats been expelled from Europe since the invasion. A great majority of them were indeed spies. So that's the diplomats. And then there was all kinds of business people here as well. And again, I stress this isn't to say that everybody who comes here from that country or from Iran is here to cause trouble. Of course, that's not the case. But that there is that constant free flow of people in very apparently legitimate ways.
We live in an interconnected world where people, have been able to travel and work and go freely wherever they like for, within sort of some boundaries for a long time. And obviously, as we continue and the West continues to sort of slap sanctions on Russia and to expel diplomats, and he's, talking about it's not flashy, but it works, kick them out, keep them out. That is just going to make Putin even more desperate. And he's talking about now Russian targets include sensitive government information, technology, democracy, even journalists as well, saying that we're all now more at risk because of the extent that we've kicked out all of these spies, and that they're now looking for even more desperate attempts to try and infiltrate our lives in so many different ways. And the internet, of course, is going to be a huge part of that.
Well, we've heard from journalists like Sarah Rainsford. During the release, there was an American journalist, sorry, his name escapes me momentarily, a young American journalist who was held in Russia as well. Journalists are targets now, aren't they, if they go abroad?
Yes, of course, exactly. I think I think it's fair to say I don't think I'd feel safe going to Russia.
No.
And
don't do it.
No, well, I've got no plans to. But genuinely, I think it is the case that, like I say, as Putin gets more desperate, the war in Ukraine continues to go on, and we're seeing even sort of today the idea that there could be troops from North Korea fighting in Ukraine as well. All of these interconnected actors as well, starting to team up. And we see that with the wider Middle East conflict, with the role that Iran has obviously been playing behind the scenes, arming Russia as well, sending missiles to Russia as well. It's all very interconnected. And like I say, presents a really, really stark, dark, gloomy, worrying picture for our UK spooks here, because at some point there is a risk that does come to our shores too.
Just a final thought on the competing ideologies that he alluded to. Because they're not all from people from outside of the UK. They're from people who live within the UK, whether that's far-right extremists or, extreme right-wing fascists, or whether it's violent Islamists or people starting to be attracted to political and violent Islamism. That's a problem, isn't it? Because it needn't be if you can identify those people. But I suppose it seems to me, and this is kind of where I want the conversation with callers to go really, is, MI5 will do MI5. We can't do any of that work for them and with them. But what do we do as ordinary citizens, I wonder? Whether that's as a parent, as a teacher, as a broadcaster, whatever it is, what do we do to help to build a kind of cohesion in this country where any of the people who would choose that kind of activity will be a small rump of people that can be controlled, yes, if they end up doing it, but weeded out, found out, rather than it become a widespread thing. Because if it becomes a widespread thing that people resort to violence to make their political points, we're in deep, deep trouble.
Yeah, and I think arguably we already are. The fact that, we're talking about youngsters getting so involved and taking up so much of MI5's time, that's obviously something that's gone on for years, right? So they are not going to probably be sort of I'm speculating here, under sevens, but they're going to be people that have been brought up with smartphones. They're going to be people that are brought up in a family of smartphones, that have access to the internet, and that, might be teenagers who have been over years radicalised to information on the internet. And one of McCallum's interesting points was he talks about how straightforward labels like Islamist terrorism or extreme right wing do not reflect the dizzying range of beliefs and ideologies we see now. It is both extreme right wing and Islamist extremist material, and the access that you can get online, it is staggering what you can get access to, and not just in terms of the ideas, in terms of the sort of belief system, but in terms of like the actual how-to, things that are available on the dark web, conspiracy theories, disinformation. There's so much there, and it's like I say, I think he's fighting an uphill battle here. And he didn't say this, obviously. They can't come out and say I need more money from the government, but he said he's just looking at the amount of threats. It's the most he can ever remember in his career trying to deal with combat. So it's going to be a real uphill struggle for him trying to do and combat all of this, all of these threats.
Thank you, Natasha. Natasha Clark, LBC's political editor. I think identity politics has a part to play in all of this, good and bad.